It's the end of the day with Ray. Hello, my friends. Today I'm excited to have in that sharp interactive board David Finz. And David Finz is with the cyber insurance industry. He works for a company called Alliant. This is an exciting episode, folks, because we've never talked about cyber insurance on the end of the day with Ray. But as I move more into that IT services space, I was kind of alarmed at some of the things me and David were talking about. So without any further ado, let's just jump in there and talk with David. David, how are you doing? And welcome to the end of the day with Ray.
Doing great. Thanks for having me, Ray.
Well, David, we were having a conversation yesterday a little bit, and it's kind of horrifying, some of the stories you were sharing with me. But, before we get started, why don't you share with the audience a little bit about yourself and Alliant?
Sure. So I've been in the insurance industry for coming up on 17 years now. I've spent most of that time on the broker side of the business, meaning I represent the interests of the policyholder, or as we typically call them, the insured. And over the past seven and a half years or so, have been focusing primarily on the area of cyber insurance and technology E&O, as we call it, errors and omissions. And so, these are companies that are providing technology products or software as a service to their customers. Mm-hmm. And as part of that B2B relationship, one of the things they have to think about is the liability they might incur if they have a business interruption, or if their network is compromised, or any data that they have been entrusted with is stolen. Alliant has been around for about 100 years. It's a full-service property and casualty broker in all 50 states, and we do have an active cyber practice as part of that.
Well, it's pretty interesting. Our friends out there, they're trying to pivot from print into IT services, and I would question, so I'm going to ask you, when you talk to companies that have a cyber insurance policy, or maybe you're selling them a cyber insurance policy, is there any language in those policies that, really pertain to the resellers of technology to those companies? In other words, are there rules, like you can't sign up with this IT services company because if you do, you're going to violate the policy we just wrote for you?
Well, there's definitely two aspects to that, right? One is the vendor management that is so important for any business that is looking to purchase cyber insurance. So underwriters are going to want to know what your contracts contain with respect to limitations of liability, indemnification, whether you are waiving subrogation on behalf of your insurance carrier so that they can't recover on a claim. All of these are factors that go into that. But then on the backside of it, when there is a claim, you have all of these different cybersecurity vendors. You have e-discovery vendors that have large quantities of data, forensics investigators, and these companies themselves need to be vetted by the underwriters, and because they're the ones that are going to be handling the incident response when a breach occurs. And amazingly, some of these companies, they themselves are only now looking into buying cyber insurance. It's kind of a case of the shoemaker going barefoot, where they don't themselves have the coverage that is so vital to handling these types of incidents.
Well, it's amazing. We can see some folks, they'll get into IT services and they don't even deploy what they're delivering into the marketplace to their own environment. So that, eat your own dog food kind of a thing. And that's so important. I just never understood that. But so let me ask you a question. If you go into an account and you're doing an assessment, would you help a dealer assess an insurance policy that a customer might have? And then I guess at the end of the day, the other thing is they should be bringing you in to talk about cyber insurance as part of the assessment. Do you do any of that now?
Yeah. Right. So part of what we do within the specialty claims group is to make ourselves available to review contracts for our clients. Now, again, I need to be very clear about this. We are not a law firm, and we're not in the business of dispensing legal advice. But what we can do is we can look at a contract to see how it lines up with our client's insurance policy. What are they agreeing to? How would the coverage respond if there were a business interruption or a data breach? And are they taking liberties that the policy doesn't allow them to do? Like, as I said, for example, waiving their carrier's right to subrogation where they're not permitted to do so. That's one of the things that we can help negotiate, is to give them the flexibility to do that where it's required by contract. I mean, the fact is, oftentimes businesses are entering into these deals and they're signing SLAs without consulting their insurance policy, without actually seeing how that impacts the availability of coverage that they might have if there's an incident. And so we encourage them to consult with us around that, so then they can make an informed business decision.
Well, let me ask you this, when you go out into the marketplace, and let's talk about the smaller side of the SMB space, so maybe companies that are under $100 million a year in business, which is a lot of the size companies that a lot of our friends are going to be selling to in this space. You know, do those in those organizations, who's buying cyber insurance for the organization, number one, and then number two, are they buying it?
Sure. So, I mean, having had experience working with some of the largest tech and telecom companies in this country, right? I'm accustomed to that they're having a very large risk management department that have this as their full-time job. As you get into the smaller and mid-sized businesses, often there's not a designated risk management function within the company. So you might have the treasurer, the CFO, maybe the general counsel. I mean, I've even had cases where it's the employee benefits specialist who somehow gets stuck with the insurance purchase, right? And so these are people who are not necessarily living in the risk management world day in, day out. And that's where actually it's very important to have a trusted risk advisor. For those clients, we see ourselves as an extension of their own risk management function. We want to be there to consult with them so that they can maximize the benefits they're entitled to under their policies, and so that they can present themselves in the best possible light to the underwriters and make a good impression so that they can get favorable terms.
Well, it just seems to me that it's almost another service that my friends could almost offer. It just, from the evaluation point of view for the cyber insurance, connecting the customer to folks like you to help them navigate through that. And that, of course, that would all be fee based. It's not like you're going to do that for nothing.
Right.
But
I think it needs to be part of the conversation,
absolutely.
Right? As these companies are transacting business, to be looking at their own coverage and also asking the right questions about their vendors, so that they know if there is an incident, ultimately that liability is going to be traced back to the service provider. What coverage do they have available? Because that's the financial assurance that you as a customer have that your losses are going to be paid.
Mm-hmm. Let's say that a customer had an insurance policy, and in that insurance policy there was a rule around two-factor authentication, or maybe there was a rule around if you ever have to transfer money, to a different location or whatever it is, it has to have two people approve it, or maybe three people approve it. And then that organization signs up with an MSP that doesn't check into any of that stuff, and they're out there with their own environment and they don't use two-factor authentication as an example. The customer gets breached. They didn't enforce the two-factor authentication to the end user, and now the end user doesn't get the insurance policy paid. Who's liable in that case?
That's an excellent question, Ray. And the fact of the matter is the underwriters are asking more questions about security controls. Their criteria over the past 2 years has become more stringent. It has to be because of the losses that have been mounting, particularly around ransomware. Mm-hmm. And so they do want representations from their insureds that they have two-factor authentication, endpoint detection and response, phishing training for their employees. The next level of that, right, conceptually would be, and what are you asking of your vendors? Now, I don't know that they're drilling down to that level yet, but I think that as an insured, you want to ask those questions, because what good is your assurances that you're using 2FA when, in fact, so much of your data is residing with a service provider who may not be, right? I mean, they say a chain's only as good as its weakest link. Well, your security controls are only as good as those of the weakest party that you entrust with your data or your customers' data.
Well, it just seems to me that this is interesting, and I'm hoping that my friends are paying attention, because I think there's a whole nother service here that we could be offering as an industry. I mean, we could help customers navigate through cyber insurance and not even be an IT service provider, as long as we partner with the right people that could help us do that as a business conversation. And on the other side, our own business itself, what kind of cyber security insurance do we have? Or how are we talking about that? Who are we talking about this with? And are we going to violate any of the rules that make us unsafe? We have to have best practices. Do you provide, whether they're end users or service providers, because I know you deal with both, do you provide them best practices at all, or do you have anything around that?
Sure. So we actually have and I'll show you a copy of it here, a handout called Protecting Your Organization Against Ransomware. And this provides our clients with near, medium, and long-term security controls that they should have in place. Now, we are not a cybersecurity vendor. We're not going and looking under the hood to make sure that they have these controls or to implement them, and we can connect them with the right service providers who can offer those to them. And these are the checklists, if you will, that the underwriters are using. These are the controls that they want to see you have in place, because in handling the claims, they see where the losses come in from, and they're able to correlate what moves the needle for them in terms of seeing that you're taking cyber hygiene seriously.
Do the cyber insurance folks ever do audits on the clients? Or do they just wait for something to happen and then they either violate their policy or they didn't?
Well, I mean, it's not in terms of an invasive audit like penetration testing or something like that. Typically, they will run a non-invasive vulnerability scan, which will indicate to them whether there are any known deficiencies in security that can be addressed. This is less expensive and not as intrusive, say, as pen testing would be. And not incidentally, these tools that the underwriters use to conduct the vulnerability scan are the same indicia that a hacker may be looking for, right? I mean, we're using it for a purpose of trying to make sure that you have good controls so that you can get insurance. But these are the cyber equivalent, right, of the broken windows or the newspapers piling up on the front stoop that might indicate to the burglar that you're an attractive target. So in the same concept here of making sure that you are not giving off visibly to potential attackers that you have given them an entry point, if you will.
What are some of the fines, David? Let's talk about the fine for an MSP. So I'm a service provider. I'm dealing with the SMB space. Maybe I did something wrong as an MSP provider. I either didn't use two-factor authentication or had some really bad practices, and now there's a lawsuit. And let's say that I am actually determined to be at fault. What kind of fines do these folks face?
Well, there's two potential sources of fines and penalties, right? One could be arising from the contract with their customer, right? The contract itself may set forth some cap on damages, some limitation of liability. It's not uncommon to see service providers cap their liability at the equivalent of 12 months fee to their customer, although you have to think about it like this if you're the customer, right? 12 months fee to you times how many other customers may also be suffering as a result of this service provider's outage to their network, that can really begin to add up. And that's why it's important to make sure that your vendors that you're dealing with have cyber insurance. And the other potential source of liability comes from regulators. And depending on what industry you're in or where you reside geographically, there could be some state or federal level regulatory proceeding where you have to incur legal fees to respond and potentially have to pay out some form of penalty as a result. California now has some of the strictest laws in the country with respect to consumer data protection. Colorado and Virginia are following suit, and there are several other states that are beginning to consider legislation that would go beyond "we're sorry that your information was compromised, here's 12 months credit monitoring," right? That sort of breach notification is standard now, but now we're looking at really getting into the privacy practices of these firms and potentially assessing penalties against them for doing so. The New York State is already going after financial institutions in this way, and we can expect that to spread to other regions of the country and other industries.
If you're an IT provider and you have your client, so the client's going to engage with you in business, should you demand to that client that all the vendors they deal with have a cyber insurance? I mean, shouldn't that be kind of standard practice for your deliverable?
I mean, putting aside the fact that I think it'd be the best practice for any company in the document imaging or technology space to have a risk transfer solution, I think that's a wise thing for them to do anyway. I don't know that an individual vendor is going to be able to succeed in getting the customer to produce evidence that they have those relationships, those provisions in place with all of their vendor relationships, right? Think about it from the vendor standpoint. They want to make the sale. They may be satisfied with the customer simply representing to them that they required of all the other vendors, because your point's well taken. There could be some finger pointing involved in terms of who is ultimately responsible for some breach, some compromise to someone's network. we saw this recently with Kaseya, right? Many MSPs relied on them as a downstream service provider. And so when they were attacked, the MSPs wound up being vulnerable to pushing out updates that themselves might have been infecting their customers' networks. How do you then attribute liability? So it's a good thing to have to make sure everybody has a risk transfer solution, but keep in mind that just because you purchase insurance doesn't mean you're off the hook entirely. You have a retention, which functions like a deductible. Mm-hmm. Your losses might exceed the limits of the policy. And there may be certain types of damages, like punitive damages, that depending on where you're incorporated and what law applies, they may not be insurable. So you can't just insure away the problem. You need to have the best security controls in place to prevent something from happening in the first place.
Yeah, well, good point. It's all about best practices. Most of these, ransom attacks and the fish, it's all human. It's a human problem. It's not really a software problem if people paid attention to what they were doing. Well, we could talk about this for a long time. I want to bring you back on, and maybe we could rifle focus on the end user. But I think our friends, they just have to. This is just another thing they need to be paying attention to. And if you're out there in the marketplace talking to end users and you're not talking about cyber insurance, I think you're missing the boat. And it could be a differentiator between one MSP and another. It gives you a much more, I think it's more of a mature business when you're in there talking about real business problems. David, is there anything you want to add before? I think you had a little book you wanted to pass out to a few of the audience. Share that with us real quick.
Sure, Ray. We want to do a special promotion today for all of your viewers. I know that the topic of cyber insurance may be new to some folks, particularly small and mid-sized businesses who might be considering the coverage for the first time. And so I have some copies here of my book, The Cyber Insurance Imperative, which is available on Kindle and also in paperback. I'd be happy to send these. I've got 10 copies here to the first 10 viewers that contact us. I'd be happy to give you my information. You can DM me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at david.finz, that's david.finz, at Alliant.com, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of this book, and I'll even cover shipping and handling. It's a real easy read. It's not written in a technical fashion. It's really designed for the newcomer to this space to get them acquainted with the topic and to try to educate them, because that's what brokers really need to be doing, is educating businesses about how to better protect themselves.
Well, it's in the education piece that brings you the value that allows you to charge the right pricing for whatever, whatever you do.
We want to be more than just placing the transaction.
Absolutely.
We want to actually advise them and help them find a more rewarding way to manage risk.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. I can't wait to have you again, because we all know this. Status quo is the killer of all that'll be invented. Don't get stuck in status quo, and I'll see you all tomorrow.